most people who go to prison are going to come out of prison. They're going to come out of prison and they're going to live in your street or my street or someone else's street. Therefore, it seems the obvious purpose to prison should be, how do we make them into good neighbours? A lot of people in prison are in prison. Yes, they've committed crimes, but they have other issues. They may have come from a terrible family background. They may have addiction issues. They may have mental health issues. They may have educational issues. There's a lot of reasons why people are in prison. And if you can force people to confront their demons in more progressive societies, and what I saw in Norway is actually what they say is, we're going to make you confront your demons. We're going to try and get you to face up to the fact, why are you addicted on drugs? Why do you drink too much? Why are you violent? So everything is geared towards the fact, let's try and help these people turn their lives around so they reoffend less.
Right, we good? We are good.
I actually turned down almost everything I get asked to do like this.
Really?
Yeah.
So I'm privileged.
Well, I did it because you're a pal. So.
Oh, thanks, man. Well, I had a good time with you out in Africa.
And I did as well, so that's why I'm here.
So that was actually quite interesting as well, was I think you arrived on that trip as a skeptic and were surprised by the things you saw.
Definitely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I came open-minded, but on the skeptical wing. And the thing that really broke through was everyone saying that they didn't like cryptocurrency, but like Bitcoin. I thought, okay, that's interesting. And obviously Alex, I know and have faith, trust the guy.
Yeah.
And I just thought everyone was interesting. I liked where they were coming from.
Yeah.
And I'm still not 100% convinced, but I totally believe in Bitcoin having a role to play at the very least.
I think it's always interesting for someone like us when somebody does come, open-minded and skeptical and then spends a bit of time, and I think Bitcoin is always something different from what they expect.
Yeah,
and it's a different world, and it's always interesting to see. But I was just kind of like observing you from the distance.
Well, I like that everyone was coming at it from the same place I approached the world and journalism, which was essentially a humanitarian approach.
Yeah,
and that struck a chord. And I thought some of the people were too ideological about it and have too much faith in its power to change the world. Because I'm always skeptical of people who have grand designs and think that you can make a perfect world through an ideology. But equally others, I thought, were very logical about it and had interesting thoughts on it.
Well, I mean, you wrote a really good piece, which I will share out as well. But look, good to see you. So we had Anna Chekovich in. We released a show with her yesterday, and I was quite proud of it. I mean, I'm quite firm in my views that Russia has illegally invaded a country and causing needless death in a democracy. I've been to Kyiv. I'm sure you've been out there. It was a beautiful country when I went.
I was there. I arrived the day before the Maidan killings, and I spent the whole of the month in Crimea watching that being taken. I was in Donetsk when the Russian tanks arrived. I was shot at by a Russian sniper.
What?
I was in the field where I saw all the bodies from MH17 when it was shot down, watching them being looted by people. And I was there a month before the war began, full-scale war in 2022, spent 6 months there in 2022 and have since been back several times. So
you've seen it all.
I'm very committed to Ukraine and supportive of Ukraine's fight for survival.
So what do you make of when you see, I would say there's a large American conservative set of voices, some that now appear to have been paid, unintentionally, some claim, paid by to spread Russian disinformation. But what do you make of all that? Because I sit in this world where we're here in Europe, and it's almost unilateral support for Ukraine. But in the US, it's become another divisive figure.
Less so in parts of it. I mean, Germany now, the mood is changing. Southern Europe, there's a strand against it. But
is that a strand of conservatism?
Well, it's on left and right. I think it's one of those issues where the left and the far left and the far right come together and have a similar approach. I think it's very unusual, the war in Ukraine, because I've covered a lot, several conflicts and unrest and things like that. To me, this is the only one I can think of in my lifetime where it's so clear that there is an aggressor who is 100% at fault, and there's no excuse whatsoever, and it's done purely on the whim of a dictator who I think went a little bit bonkers during COVID when he was locked away and frightened of seeing people, listening to very few people, genuinely thought he was going to win in 3 or 4 days, that he'd be welcomed with open arms by a sizable rump of the population, and was surprised to find that people really cared about their own country. They cared about Ukraine, they cared about democracy, they cared about freedom, and they cared about their community. And they fought back with such intensity. And I think that's been a real surprise. It's very sad that people living in comfortable societies who have all the freedoms these people want to share are foolish enough, stupid enough, or tribal enough, often it's tribal and it's politically motivated, to support a really reprehensible dictator who is a mass murderer and a thief who's destroying his country.
Pretty clear. Yeah, it's been kind of depressing for me. I mean, when this interview went out, the first bunch of comments that came on YouTube were all very critical of the West, saying, well, all these same issues that you've discussed here are all had in the West, you know. And I find it thoroughly depressing as somebody who, I mean, I can't articulate it as clearly as you, but I'm pretty firm in my views that this is an illegal war, that people are dying unnecessarily. I know people who lived in Ukraine who've had to leave. I get really depressed that this has become part of the discourse that separates people at the moment through ideology. And I don't know where to go with it. It's kind of in some ways a reflection of everything at the moment. There seems to be just issue after issue after issue where people are picking a side and you're almost forced to. But this one, I don't understand why people aren't supportive of Ukraine.
No, I agree. I think one of the great curses of our time is tribalism. Yeah. Something I hate. I see it in journalism. I see it in politics. And that people think, okay, so this is where my side is, so I've got to support it rightly or wrongly. We see it with Israel and Gaza, where it's become almost like a football match. Either you're red or a blue. You support one team or the other. And you can't accept the fact that actually there's terrible political leadership on both sides. There's terrible things happening on both sides. And that ordinary people, good people, families, communities are getting crushed as a result of it. I think tribalism is one of the great curses of our time, and it stops. I saw it in politics myself during a brief immersion in politics, and I think it's absolutely awful, and it stops so many things happening. It stops people coming together. And I know later on we're going to talk about prison reform, and one of the things that was so interesting about that was how it broke through those tribal walls and came up with a solution for the benefit of society. And it's so unusual that it kind of blew my mind.
Why do you think this tribalism's got so bad? And is there any way out of it?
It's a good question. I guess there's always been tribalism to some extent, that either you were Labour or you were Tory in the old days in this country, or in America you were a Republican or you were a Democrat. I don't really know. I mean, social media is obviously a factor, that it encourages and drives people to a more hardened extreme position, and it fuels extremism. Clearly, we know from, and I've seen it in countries like Slovakia, that dictatorships like Russia particularly, but not just Russia, are deliberately using social media as a device to intensify the divisions, and they've done it very successfully, as we know in this country. It's hard to know, though, why it's become such a thing. What always puzzles me in America, when I travel around in America, where clearly there are these huge divisions, and there's absolutely no common ground between maybe young Democrats in a city and more rural Republicans. And yet you talk to people and they're all such nice people 99% of the time.
Yep.
They're very decent people, they're very kind people, they're very open, and they really sort of want the same sorts of things. And then at the end, they might say something utterly bizarre and twisted, showing how contaminated they are by this tribalism. And it's kind of sad, really, that there is this very divisive thing. And I try always in my journalism to look at the issue not to be tribal, which is confusing. And I guess, it's much easier for people if journalists are very tribal, so they know that he's a Tory and she's Labour or whatever. But I just think tribalism is a curse, and it's terrible, and it's something we should really work hard to combat. Yeah. And it's very interesting. If you go to Finland, so Finland has the most faith in the media of any country in the world, and most trust in its leaders of any country in the world. And one of the reasons is because They embed critical thinking in their education system. They sit next door to Russia with a great long border with Russia. And particularly after 2014, they were aware of the power and the danger and the toxicity of Russian disinformation. So in every class, they embed critical thinking. So in art, they look at propaganda. In maths, they look at algorithms and things like this. And they encourage kids to question facts. And as a result of that, you go there, and I went there and I went into a school, and the kids would all say, oh yeah, we'll look at Wikipedia, but we'll always check the sourcing and the facts, because they know that facts you see may not actually be true. They may be false, and they need to be checked. And it seems such an obvious lesson that in the world we live in today, where technology is so powerful, where there is disinformation, and even before AI comes into play, we should be doing the same. We should be embedding critical thinking into the education system to arm generations how to navigate this world that we're living in, because, we don't really know, and it's a new world, and we need new methods of navigation. And I was blown away to see it's such an obvious thing. And of course, whenever you mention it to anyone, they think, yeah, of course you should do that. But so few countries do it. And the result, it pays off in Finland because they have trust within their communities. They have trust, or more trust, within their political system, and more trust in their media.
Well, as a parent of a kid who's left school and one's still in school, it's not the only change I would make.
No, there are other changes you could make as well, but that seems an obvious one that everyone could agree on.
Well, I think if you teach kids critical thinking, that will be a problem for the government themselves in the short term.
Well, maybe, but we could all do with a few changes to our political system as well as our education system.
Yeah, I do wonder how much the social media has played into this as well. I even put a tweet out yesterday because my Twitter's just a fucking shit show now. It's a combination of fights, people getting killed, and endless arguments over nothing. And it's just become. It used to be like a very useful tool. It's become more like doom porn.
Yeah, I think it's sad. Twitter was wonderful at one point. I know it had its downsides, and I'm a white male, and it's much easier for people like me. But it was a really nice community where it's interesting. You learn stuff. You found new. I've made friends through Twitter, who I met through that. It was great. Now I think it's a much less useful vehicle, and I think it's really sad that it's being ruined really by Musk and the way he's running it, and the new way that algorithms are pushing people into certain positions.
Yeah, it's so interesting on that point as well, because he obviously has a large fan base. A lot of people really like Musk and think he's become a champion of free speech. I mean, I think there are holes in that story. Plenty of journalists have written the holes in that story.
Also, free speech, as everyone believes in free speech, the issue has always been, where do you draw the line? You always have a line. It's just where that line should be drawn. There's no such thing as total free speech. And Musk, of course, is fascinating because in many ways, it was amazing what he did with space technology is incredible. With electronic vehicles, he was a real visionary on that sort of stuff. But it's kind of sad to see where he's ended up and the positions he's taking and the way he's willfully spreading disinformation.
Is that happening a lot? Because I haven't gone out there and measured it. Like I say, I barely look at it now, and I barely look at his tweets. I use it a lot less these days.
Sadly, I'm the same, but it's still an important vehicle, I think, for journalists, but increasing or decreasing in its importance, which is a real shame.
Do you think it's therefore exacerbating the problems? If good journalists like yourself are using it less, it's going to be more exploited by... Because I feel like there's this new independent media, which I think it was a bit of hope at time when traditional media or the corporate media had been failing to some extent. And there was this kind of like idea of new kind of independent journalists and independent media are able to create a platform and maybe have conversations which other sources wouldn't have. But I feel like large majority of them have fallen for a worse trap.
Well, I mean, I was certainly a subscriber to the idea that the internet was a fantastic liberating force and democratic force, and it empowered ordinary people against established organizations and interests. And let's not forget, it has played a role in that. I mean, it still does. It is important in that, in holding power to account. So I think it's easy to forget that. But at the same time, I think it has become a very toxic, malevolent force, and it's being exploited by agents who know how to exploit it. And ultimately, it's malevolent. And we're beginning to see the damage that it does to particularly teenage girls for mental health, where Instagram and things like that particularly are a real problem. And we haven't really begun to grapple with how do we handle this new technology that was supposed to be this liberating force. It does still have elements of that and still has lots to praise it, and it still does, it's brilliant at the way it does disseminate information and it does empower people. But equally, it has a very dark, malevolent side, which we haven't really begun to grapple. And of course, it's interesting in recent days to see the battle between Brazil and Elon Musk, to see what's happened with the Telegram boss in France, to see the fine that Apple has been forced to pay in Europe. It is interesting to see that national sovereign governments are now grasping their way towards fighting back. It's a battle I think we're just in the foothills of, and it's got a long, long way to go. And it's a really difficult one because, we've talked before about Bitcoin. One of the intriguing things to me about Bitcoin as someone who came to it, certainly on the skeptical side of it, and was really interested in what I saw with you and others in its use in Malawi and Kenya. But one of the interesting things about Bitcoin is that it clearly is an uncontrollable force. Therefore, it can be used for malevolent reasons. It can be used, say, for terrorists to transfer money, or for gangs to launder money, or for despots to launder their stolen money. Equally, within a dictatorship, it's a really important thing. And you talked to Anna, in Russia, Bitcoin has been absolutely vital to supporting Navalny and supporting the opposition when, as I'm sure she's told you, and I've heard her talk about it, so many extreme measures were being taken to track down not just them, but all their funders and put pressure on the banks and the financial institutions. So it's a really hard thing to work out. How do democracies grapple with these issues in a way that doesn't benefit dictatorships? And I have no idea what the answers are to a lot of these things, but these are really important discussions upon which really maybe the future of our societies to a large extent depends.
Well, so look, there are a number of reasons why I championed Bitcoin, and I'm a supporter and try to promote its use. One of those being, obviously Alex Garcia and the Human Rights Foundation, they champion this. That it's a very useful tool for activists. And sadly, there've been a couple of cases this year where companies that run services to make your Bitcoin more private, because it's not private by nature, because the blockchain is transparent. Wasabi was one, Samurai is another. That people have started to be arrested, accused of providing a service to launder money, and so there's like a chilling effect where if you haven't been arrested, you've closed it down. But these were tools that were also essential alongside Bitcoin for the people who wanted to donate.
But that's what's so interesting, isn't it? Because these are valid debates on both sides of the equation.
Totally.
And I can't see, and maybe you can with your knowledge of Bitcoin, which is far superior to mine, but it's very hard to see how do you navigate this and how do you find methods that can perhaps track the money laundering without squashing the dissidents and the freedom fighters in dictatorships.
It's just a hard subject, but I would always default to supporting the activists of what they need. These are useful tools, and you can't turn off a tap for a criminal. All you can do is divert the water to another direction. They will always find ways to launder money, move money. Then it's just how it is. You can't stop it.
Also, to be honest, if you want to crack down on money laundering, it's quite easy to go and stop the lawyers who are doing it in this country and the estate agents who are doing it and the banks who are doing it.
Can't say this.
A lot of money laundering is very obvious and very open, and nothing is done about it.
But it goes back to the banks as well. The government offloaded bank surveillance to the banks themselves. I lost my 20-year account with Lloyd's because I got a phone call from a call center, but I don't know how old the person is, but I'm assuming somebody in their 20s wanting to ask me about money I'd sent to various places and why I was doing it. I just said, look, it's none of your fucking business. And they closed my account down. But the percentage of crime they're stopping is very small. But the amount of bureaucracy they're adding to the banks and the amount of surveillance they're adding to the banking system I don't think the trade-off has been there. I think that it's gone too far.
But that is a problem in modern society, that we have a culture which is developing, which calcifies and adds layers and layers of checks and boxes to be ticked, often not actually achieving very much. And It's designed for good reasons, and people have good intentions as to why they do it. But the impact of it is disastrous and just adds all these layers of pointless bureaucracy and stops things being done. And we see it, I wrote a lot on disability. We see it in the benefits world where there's this, you see it, talk to any business person, some of the things they have to go through. Why do we have such problems with planning in this country? Well, one of the reasons is because you've got to go through so many hoops in order to build something. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, some of them are very valid, and you want to make sure that buildings are sympathetic for the local community, but equally a lot of them are just bonkers and insane and designed to stop one particular minor problem that may have once occurred in Bedford, for instance, and is completely irrelevant for other parts of the country.
I can give you a great one on that. When I bought my last house, it had to have a disabled ramp on it. And I assume this is every house now has to have a disabled ramp. It was a disabled ramp that went down to a gravel pathway, which is very difficult for a wheelchair on. But once I've moved into the house, I can remove the ramp. And so I'm just wondering how many ramps are now getting built and then removed after people have moved into the houses. And I've seen endless things we're planning with the football club and things we're trying to do with that. And a lot of the things we're planning these days is also, especially commercial planning, is, well, what can you do for us? What are the additional things you can do for us? Like if you want to build a football pitch, well, what are you giving to the local community? And, what bike racks are you putting up? And there's lots of little additional layers that slow things down and make things cost prohibitive.
And some of those are quite logical. So there should be bike racks and there should be a community benefit, I think.
Well, you say that, our football club. So for our planning, we have to have bike racks. But at the moment, we've got a fence there. People just lock their bikes to the fence. Why do we have to build brand new set of bike racks? It's not necessary, and hardly anyone actually bikes there. It's maybe twice a year someone will bike there. So I'm not there with the full logic on it. I think you leave that decision to the commercial operator of whether they think they need the bike racks.
Yeah, okay, I'll buy that.
My problem is the people I deal with, I've dealt with often. I wouldn't employ these people. And it's
well, that's true in many parts of walks of life, isn't it?
Yeah. Back to the Bitcoin thing. The other look, there's no utopia. Bitcoin itself isn't even a utopia. I prefer a neutral peer-to-peer money which can't be inflated, and so I like that. And I like all the benefits that come from that. The other thing, have you looked at Nostr?
I know about, yeah.
Nostr
is really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting.
And it's one of these ideas, it's logically, I think it makes total sense. But the problem is that if Twitter is breaking down, as it appears to be, people are going off, some to Mastodon, some are going to Blue Sky, some are going to Threads, maybe some go to Nostr. It's very hard for any of those to build up that critical mass to make it the next Twitter or the next, power player in all this. Whether Nostr can do it, I don't know. It seems to me that we're seeing more fragmentation, which is a bad thing. So I've noticed that there's a lot of Financial Times journalists, for instance, have gone to Blue Sky. There's a lot of the Bitcoin crowd have gone to Nostr, partly because of Jack Dorsey's involvement. This isn't great if everyone's going off and there's new silos emerging, because the joy of Twitter in its heyday was that it brought everyone together, and you suddenly stumbled upon something you had no idea or interest in, and suddenly you think, wow, that's interesting.
Problem with Twitter at the moment, I still call it Twitter, is that it might be the same for you. I use it because I have to, because it still has good reach. If I've got a podcast I want to get out or something, I still use it for that. But I hate getting stuck in the cycle with it myself. I just find, it's nothing of interest.
That's the key, though, nothing of interest. Because for me, as a journalist who reports from around the world, I loved it because I would find so many fascinating stories, fascinating something about San Francisco or Nairobi or whatever. Now I find, actually, I'm just finding less and less on it. There's less of that information being shared there. And I think one of the latest tricks is that if you put a link in on your tweet, X, whatever you call it, it gets downgraded in the algorithms. Well, that really undermines it for someone like me, possibly for someone like you. Now, maybe Elon Musk doesn't care and he just wants me to rant about, what's going wrong in the world or whatever. But to me, it's a shame because it was such a brilliant information sharer, source, spreader, and that's disappearing before our eyes.
Yeah, well, he trapped himself into spending $44 billion on something he didn't really want. He didn't really want to buy it. He kind of
even then, you think, okay, if it was me and I'd spent 44 billion on something, I'd want to make it really good rather than want to fuck it over.
Well, it's one of those things that I don't think the decision making has been completely rational all the time. As somebody who just limited experience in the startup world, you are always trying things and you're always testing things to see what works. And I think for him,
and you aim it there and you end up there. We all know that, but he's basically pissing on his audience, pissing on the advertisers, and it just doesn't seem a good way to operate. But
I mean, look.
But then he's the world's richest man, and we're not.
Who are we to criticize? What have you done, Pete? But I just, like, as a user, I see it. He's done quite a good job at getting, large opinion leaders, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, the interviewers who put their content on there. Maybe get Donald Trump to do an interview on. He's done that well. But I actually think the biggest trap he's fallen for is the algorithm, messing around with the algorithm too much. And I think he's followed the addiction that TikTok created, this short video, scroll. Yeah. And I've got sucked into it myself, where you're like, it's 3:30 in the morning, I'm going through videos, I'm like, what the fuck am I doing?
Yeah. But we've all been there.
Yeah, I know, but the quality of the content is really low, and I've stopped seeing the content from the people I used to see it from. You'll engage with them on an article for whatever reason, then that's all I seem to get. And I've actually found I'm more of a silent user of Nostr these days. I've just been observing it. The quality of the content's a lot higher. It's actually really good. And yes, it's a fragmentation. And yes, it's sad, but I don't know. It's I think Twitter it might end up becoming a little bit 4chan.
Well, let's see.
Well, listen, I was preparing for our interview. That's a long rambling intro. I was preparing for our interview because we were going to talk about prison reform. I do want to get into that. And I went down a kind of rabbit hole of like voter issues and how much people care about this, because we are at a time where some people are going to jail for saying things on Twitter that some of them they shouldn't be saying, and others you can question about. I wanted to look into what the kind of main voter issues are and where did crime and law enforcement come on this. And interestingly, I got the list of what the primary issues UK voters care about, the 10 issues. And it was funny, as I was reading through, I just give you my setup. Economy and cost of living. Well, cost of living's gone up. Healthcare, NHS. The NHS is obviously having a very difficult time at the moment. A lot of the privatisation hasn't actually worked, even as much as free market people would want it to. I know you've covered that. Immigration and borders. Well, we've got a massive rise in immigration. Brexit and foreign policy. That's quite a broad area just to say that's poor performance. Climate change and environmental policy. Well, a lot of things are being scaled back in environmental policies. Housing affordability. I mean, we all know that the cost of mortgages has gone up. The cost of rents have gone up. Crime and law enforcement. Interestingly, violent crime's down. I looked into this. Violent crime is down, but fraud and petty theft is up. And I think people are feeling that with the kind of things you see about people just ransacking shops. Education, I know myself, I think the education system's pretty much on its knees as well. Social welfare and inequality is certainly up. And trust in government and political institutions, I think we both know the answer to that. So I was like, these are all the things that voters care about. It feels like everything's going to shit.
Although you would probably always say that about a lot of those things.
Is it managed decline?
Well, I think there are issues about the decline of the West. I don't think these are managed decline. I think the NHS, I mean, I've long been a critic of the NHS through my own daughter has very severe disabilities and health problems. And I saw for myself how bad the NHS can be at treating people with complex problems and how bad it is towards the most vulnerable people in society. So I've long been a critic of the NHS, not the idea of the NHS, because we need universal healthcare, of course, but the fact that I think there's an arrogance of the medical profession. I think that there's this idea the NHS was some kind of wonder of the world. During the Olympics, I was like a lone voice saying, why are we celebrating it? It's a public service and it doesn't work very well. We have bad outcomes. We have bad treatment outcomes and things like cancer and things like amenable mortality, i.e. conditions which you shouldn't die from and do die from. And yet we were celebrating it. And that fetishization of the NHS, that idea that we were somehow special and we had this fantastic jewel, now we're seeing the truth of it, that actually it's been allowed to corrode. It's not very good at a lot of things. It's great at other things. There are some brilliant staff there and there's some bad staff. It's basically like any other institution that has its strengths and weaknesses.
How much have you actually looked into it from the journalist side?
I've written endlessly on the NHS.
So how do you solve it? I've been in the had one foot in the libertarian camp for the last 7 years, and there is a firm belief that universal healthcare doesn't work and won't work and shouldn't exist. At the same time, I've spent a lot of time in America, and I think their health system, good outcomes if you're rich. If you're wealthy.
So America spends, I think it's 15% of its national income on health and has lower life expectancy than many other countries and worse health outcomes. And a lot of people don't have any health cover. Most European countries spend maybe Italy's 9%, Britain's 10%, France slightly more, and we have better outcomes. I absolutely support the idea of universal healthcare. Without it, my daughter probably wouldn't be alive. So I don't take the libertarian view that we don't need it. There are questions over what's the best method of funding it. We've adopted one way through taxation. Other European countries have different methods. I think actually that's a kind of artificial debate. We are where we are. The idea we're going to rip it up and change to a social insurance model, I think, is unlikely to happen. It's never going to happen. So what we have to do is work out the best way to drive both value for money and efficiency, but also a better health service. At the moment, it seems to me that time and again, patients get shafted in the health service. It's run too often for the benefit of doctors and professionals.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean is they dictate. So why is it acceptable for you to go to the NHS and sit there for 2.5 hours waiting for your appointment? That doesn't happen in most European health services, but we accept that. Why is it acceptable to have so many mistakes? Why do we have safety scandal after safety scandal, often affecting people who are very old or women? You look at all these cases of the big safety scandals. The Ockenden Review, for instance, was into 3 catastrophic patient safety scandals impacting on women. There was the rogue breast surgeon who abused so many women in his treatment. And it's people with learning disabilities. It's people with disabilities. Who, according to a government study, you look at the figures for people with learning disabilities who are dying needlessly because of bigotry within the system, and there's hundreds every month. There's hundreds every year. These reflect societal issues about attitudes towards old people, towards people with learning disabilities, towards women, and you see them in the NHS. And I think it's about empowering patients to some extent. There are bureaucratic hurdles, but the idea we don't need managers is just nonsensical. What we need are good managers who actually manage for patients. We need to devolve more power, I think, actually to Frontline, to the doctors and nurses themselves, who should be taking the decisions at clinical level and at financial, where possible financially. So they get given a budget, and if they want, they manage it within themselves. It's just about taking responsibility for it, which I don't think happens. I think instead of which we've got this NHS which has developed, and it just doesn't really work for anyone at the moment. The staff are unhappy, the patients are unhappy, the waiting lists have exploded, and the patient outcomes are not very good. The NHS has very poor treatment outcomes. And yes, money is a factor, but it's not just about money. Why does Scotland, for instance, which for many years has spent more money per patient, have worse treatment outcomes? Some people might say it's because of embedded issues of poverty and diet and things like that. That probably is to some extent a factor, but it's not the only factor. And a series of reports have said that. Money is not the only answer. Money is part of the problem, but the idea you throw money at it doesn't work. And when we have thrown money at it, often it ends up in the pockets of the professionals. So when Tony Blair increased the money for the health service, and we did see improvements in the health service, and we did see waiting lists decline, equally, our GPs negotiated new contracts, which led to them becoming the best paid GPs in the world, or certainly in Europe. And they also stopped a lot of the unsocial hours working, which led to more people going to A&E. And guess what we see today? People going to A&E services. These problems have knock-on effects. And Labour's first solution has been to bung money at the junior doctors without any demand for extra changes to productivity and such like.
22% increase.
Yeah.
Yeah. I met a nurse in a food bank. I was making a documentary in Harlow on inflation, and we went to visit a food bank. First person I spoke to is, what do you do for a living? She said, I'm a nurse. And that was quite interesting. It's like, so you can't afford based on your salary, your basic needs of food and housing. And she's like, no, I can't. This is a lifeline for me. It was really sad. It actually kind of made me angry because my mum was a nurse. And to think that we have nurses that can't afford to put food on the table, I found depressing, especially knowing how much money goes in.
But then again, I agree entirely, by the way. I don't disagree with that. Equally, people always ignore the care sector, which employs more people at lower wages and deals with more people and is the cause of a lot of the problems. Under the austerity, the NHS saw its budget increase hugely. The number of doctors and nurses increased under the Tories. Social care, the budget stayed flat and demands rose hugely. Biggest rise in demand is from working age people. We have more people with complex conditions needing social care. We have an aging society and our care system is shot to pieces. People are paid poorly. Private equity is muscled in and is creaming off profits and dodging it all, spending it all in their offshore tax havens.
Where's that happened? In what kind of areas?
Look at the owners of the biggest care home groups. They've changed hands through private equity, several of them. They saw it as a property play in an aging society where they would make money, so they'd buy the property and that might increase. And also with an aging society, they would make more money. The problem is that local government got cut very hard under austerity, harder than national government. And so the money coming in from that source declined. So what we've seen is that patients who pay for their care, i.e. middle class and better off people, the fees have gone up dramatically because there's not enough money coming in from those who can't afford to pay for it. And so what does that do? It leads to a slide in care provision away from the poorer areas of the country towards the richer areas of the country. So we now have a system which is the staff don't get paid there. A lot of them are on minimum wage, scandalously. Some of the bosses are earning millions and dumping it all offshore. The care system is geared towards the wealthier areas of the country. And so many people who desperately need care to survive, just to do the basic things in life, which is to get washed, to get dressed, to go out to work, to keep your family together, to stave off mental health and depression, which comes from being trapped at home, they're not getting the care. And yet we never hear talk. Where do we hear the talk about the crisis in social care? Have you heard anything from the new Labour government? They've done things on NHS. They've had the Darzai review. They've put money into the pockets of junior doctors. Social care pumped to one side yet again. We've had commission after commission, inquiry after inquiry, looking at coming up with answers, coming up with solutions. We've had attempts by different governments to come up with solutions. Nothing happens. The social care system is in a terrible state. It's absolutely critical to the well-being of communities, of families, of individuals, and nothing gets done. And why is that? Who are the people who are being shat on with that? Oh, look, it's old people, it's women who do the bulk of care, and it's people with disabilities and people with severe health conditions.
The same people who get fucked in every scenario.
Yeah.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
Have you looked at any other health systems that you've seen are doing a better job?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of European systems are better. The French system is famously seen as the best. It has its own problems. The Thai system works very well. You go to Thailand and they have universal healthcare. It's much cheaper, and they're doing very well. So it's not just a European issue.
So what are we getting wrong?
I think there was complacency over the fetishization of the NHS as being the wonder of the world, which supposedly everyone was envious of, but no one bothered to copy. And that allowed it to get corrupted. I think there are historic issues whereby we set up a system after the war which was designed to deal with a world that doesn't exist today. So it was designed to deal with a world of industrial diseases and infant mortality, infant diseases, whereas now the issues are lifestyle issues like obesity and heart problems and things like that. And the world has changed. We have a lot of comorbidities, a lot of people with complex problems, a lot of people surviving later into life where they wouldn't before. Take someone with Down syndrome, for instance, they tend to live much longer lives than they used to, which is great. But this does impact on the sort of health system we need. So the Darzai review, which just came out, some of the solutions are absolutely right. We need far more community provision. We need to take the provision away from hospitals, which should be more last resort, have far more community provision and far more supportive. And again, it ties in with social care. It's about supporting people. If you support people, you're going to have less people with mental health conditions. We haven't even talked about the mental health service, which is absolutely awful as well, where we've developed a system in mental health, in psychiatric care, which you can get, if you can get onto it, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is for lesser issues. But all the community provision has been stripped out in the last 20, 30 years. And so then you wait till your situation explodes into a crisis, and then you get put into a secure accommodation. And in secure places, they drug you and they restrain you and they might put you in solitary confinement. So we basically have a system where there's nothing there until it explodes. And then when it explodes, you get treated in a completely dehumanizing, inhumane manner. You go to Italy, you go to Trieste, and you can see an alternative method where it's against the law in Italy to have secure hospital accommodation for psychiatric people, even for criminally and psychiatric. And you have a system which is based on community provision and on trust in the patients and listening to the patients and helping the patients. And, there are solutions to these problems. Again, I've written a lot about and campaigned on it, and there's led to government inquiries on it about people with autism and learning disabilities who end up going to get help from the NHS. The help isn't there, or they get put into something called an ATU, an assessment and treatment unit. It's meant to be for a few weeks. They end up in psychiatric care. They can be there 5-10 years. It couldn't be a worse place if you have severe autism than to be there. Often they're put in solitary confinement. They don't have a bed. They don't have any provision. Sometimes they're even put in sort of protective blankets, and they're held in solitary confinement. They're sedated. They're restrained, and it couldn't be worse treatment for someone. And this can cost hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. And guess who's making the money off this again? Often there's private operators muscled in on this like sharks smelling blood, and private equity has got involved. And they're making a fortune. People die from the terrible psychiatric care being meted out. And, there's an inquiry going on in Essex, 2,000 deaths. 2,000 deaths of people with mental health just in Essex. What does that say about our society? And again, it's not that private provision is necessarily terrible. There are some really good private operators, really good private providers. There's some very good private healthcare. And there's some really bad state provision. It's just about quality and monitoring and checks and empowering families, empowering communities, empowering individuals to take the decisions which affect them in their lives.
It feels like it's a structural issue, but also a funding issue. But it's at a time where our government says we're broke as a nation. We'd have no more money.
But it's not just funding, because we spend pretty similar amount to now to health services in other countries.
So it's a structural issue.
Well, I think funding is always an issue because there's never enough money and the demands have increased. And, it's brilliant that people live longer. We should see that as what it is, which is a boon for society. And it's fantastic that we all live longer. But equally, of course, that puts up the costs.
Yeah.
And if you're living longer with complex conditions, that's more difficult to treat. But what we have to do is adapt to it. We have to be ready to adapt. And, think about the outcry when anyone tries to close a hospital down. The local MP will jump up in arms. The local newspaper, if it exists anymore, will jump up in arms. The truth is actually probably we don't need quite so many hospitals, but we need far greater community provision, whether of physical or mental health.
All right, let's talk about law and order as well. I don't think we'll do a whole list of 10 today, but a couple of observations from mine. I follow a Twitter account about crime in London, and it shows videos and reports of various things, murders, shoplifting, phone thefts, and there seems to be a massive rise in petty crime. There seems to be a lack of respect now for policing, and we also have a prison system that is overcrowded. We know prisoners are being released early, which I don't think necessarily is in itself a problem. If you're sentenced to 15 years in prison and you serve 14, I mean, what difference that 1 year make? But on your recommendation, I have been watching documentaries about what's happened in Norway, what's happening in Texas. I know you've written about it. And I'm really intrigued by this idea that you can drastically change the outcome for people being released from prison and reduce the rate at which people commit crimes again and back up in jail. But with all of that, there was one thing that stood out to me in your article you sent me. It said there's not an agreement on the causes of crime or even the purpose of punishment. I was like, that's so fascinating. Especially the purpose of punishment. Because if the purpose is to punish and not rehabilitate, then of course you're going to have people reoffend. Of course they're going to go straight back into reoffend. If they can't get a job, if they've got no money and all they know is crime, that's what they're going to go back to. And so I ended up watching that documentary and watching that about the Norwegian prisons. And honestly, like I say, it kind of looked like center parks.
Some of them don't even have walls.
Yeah. Which I don't know which criminals you'll keep in those, but so what I mean, look, what's the goal here is to reduce the reoffending rate, to reduce the number of people ultimately in prison, and to reduce crime. This feels like a win for everyone.
It seems to me like there are some people who you're never going to reform. We have to accept that. There are some people who are, for whatever reason, they're not safe to be let out into society. Not very many, but there are some. So you need prisons for them, to lock them up, possibly forever. There are also people who deserve to be punished. There's no doubt about that. The question is really, even most people who go to prison are going to come out of prison. They're going to come out of prison and they're going to live in your street or my street or someone else's street. Therefore, it seems the obvious purpose to prison should be, how do we make them into good neighbors? Prison is about depriving them of liberty. That's the punishment. That's what I loved, what they understand in Norway. The point about Norway is they used to have a system like ours. They used to lock up lots and lots of people. They used to believe that you should, put them in shitty places, lock them up, and then you let them out.
Because they'll be scared to go back.
Yeah. And that punishment should be punishment. It should be, it should hurt. It should be tough. Then they had this change, and they realized that they had very high recidivism rates, 70% reoffending in some cases. And they thought, let's try a different approach. Now they've gone for a completely different approach. Their prisons, some of them they look amazing. As I say, some don't have walls. It's based on a graded system. So you start in the most high security ones, and then you sort of come down to the middle security, and then you go to the low security.
Is that based on just time, or you earn your way through it?
You earn your way through it.
Okay.
Or also the type of offence you've committed. So if you've killed someone, you're not going to start in the low risk one. But if you're a serial shoplifter, you might. And when you're in hospital, when you're in the prison, you cook your own meals. You decide what you're going to eat. You decide whether to work or to go into education. You can play sport. You can have a barbecue with the guards. The guards are not armed. 50% female of the guards. They're designed to be places that are not hellholes. They're designed to be places where they can encourage the individual to change their lives. A lot of people in prison are in prison. Yes, they've committed crimes, but they have other issues. They may have come from a terrible family background. They may have addiction issues. They may have mental health issues. They may have educational issues. There's a lot of reasons why people are in prison. And if you can force people to confront their demons, then that's far better than just letting them lie. I mean, in Britain, we let people lie around all day in prison. They're locked up 23 hours a day. They're stoned on weed or spice or whatever it is they're on, watching TV maybe, and then we let them out and expect them to be transformed. In more Progressive societies, and what I saw in Norway, is actually what they say is we're going to make you confront your demons. We're going to try and get you to face up to the fact, why are you addicted on drugs? Why do you drink too much? Why are you violent? Why are you illiterate? Let's get you to learn to read and write. And then we'll help you when you come out to get a job, to bond. They keep the family links going wherever possible. They try and keep you near to your family, because another key factor is if your family breaks down, you're more likely to reoffend. So everything is geared towards the fact, let's try and help these people turn their lives around so they reoffend less. And now they have the world's lowest recidivism rates of 20%, whereas we have 2.5 times that. They also understand, like other societies do, that short sentences are basically pointless. If you put someone away for 3 months, it might sound good. Put someone away for 6 months, but all you're doing is tearing up their job. You know, they're not going to go. They're going to lose their job. Therefore, they're more likely to reoffend. They might lose their family relationships, and it just disrupts their life, and they're out again in 6 weeks' time. It's utterly pointless.
Stupid punishment.
Yeah.
What do you do instead, though?
What you do is you force people to try and become better people. You put them into community punishments, which actually are community punishments. It's not just working in a charity shop or painting a wall. It's actually doing something like undergoing proper therapy or treatment for their problems, learning to read or write, constructive training for job prospects. You do things which try and help them to become better societies. The aim has to be to reduce crime and to help people to become better citizens, whereas what we have the complete opposite to that. And I was also so struck when I went to, you talked about Texas.
Yeah.
So America, not a lot of people know this, America has reduced its prison population, which is ridiculously high. We have the highest in Europe, but they dwarf us with the highest in the world.
I read they have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prison population.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah. And of course, there's a racial element to it, but that's another discussion.
And it's $44 billion a year it costs them to run their prisons.
But they have reduced the numbers by 25% over the past decade. And something really interesting has happened, which is that there's a widespread political unity on left and right that the point of prison no longer is about punishment, and you don't have these scandals over people getting a low sentence. It's about rehabilitation. It's about ending reoffending. And it all began back in Texas when they had to build, Texas locks up more people. And of course, you know, Texas is their Essex. You know, if they're the tough guys, they're the conservatives. And if Texas says something, that's going to keep the conservatives happy. And they had to lock up. They were going to spend another £2 billion on building more $2 million, on building more prisons. And then this guy called Jerry Madden, a right-wing Republican, who happened to be an engineer, not a lawyer, so he didn't know about the law system. He was told, we can't afford this, find some other way. So Jerry gets there and he gets looking at this, and then he talks with his opposite number, a Democrat. The Democrat also wasn't a lawyer, which was good. He was also in the twilight of his political career. So both of them had no knowledge and not much to lose. And they sat down and they worked out, where do we disagree? So one of them, wanted drug reform, so the other didn't. So let's park that. The other wanted longer sentences. So let's park that. And they sort of worked out what they actually agreed on was that they need to spend the money as effectively as possible and try and cut recidivism, cut the number of reoffending. And they came up with a plan to do that. So they took the money that was going to build jails and put it into rehabilitation. They set up things like drug courts. So I went to see one drug court. And it was mind-blowing. They had a 23-strong staff, and the people come in here, and if you show that you're prepared to try and deal with your addiction problems, then they will help you. They'll help you with jobs, with family, with lives, etc., and you stay out of jail. If you fail, they understand that it's not a clean line, and that if you're coming out of addiction, you're not going to be perfect, and you might fall off the wagon a couple of times. So there's it's done on a rational human basis. But if you're going in the right direction, you stay out of jail. If you're going the wrong direction, you might go to jail for 25 years. So there's a big incentive. But the judge comes in, and I went to meet Judge Bobby, and he's got all sorts of dead animals, which he shot in his courtroom, and he's a Republican, and he's a classic Texan. And then he goes into the courtroom, and he says, now you'll listen up, you motherfuckers. You might think I'm a badass motherfucker, but I'm the badass motherfucker who can put you guys in jail for 25 years. So you'll listen up to me. And you're thinking, this isn't like a British court. But he's great. He's like a father figure to these guys. And it was really moving to see how these guys, who often they'd never had anyone believe in them. They'd come from a shitty background and a broken home, and they'd done crappy jobs, and their education had all gone astray. They'd never really had anyone believing them. And suddenly there's a system and a person and a court which is actually trying to help them and believing in them. And it was really moving to see how they try and help these people. It doesn't always work, of course. And but equally, I met a guy who told me he'd killed 6 people and he was out of prison because he was the poster boy for this system. And I filmed that for Panorama for the BBC. I did on it. I took Michael Gove out to see it, and it's really impressive. And so now in America, you have this right on crime movement whereby the right use the language of their own political culture to address the fact that prison isn't working. So if you're anti the state, anti-government, prison is an example of state failure because the recidivism rate's so high. If you're a fiscal conservative and you care about money, then it's a waste of money. So let's not spend money on prison because it's an ineffective use of money. If you're religious conservative, you believe in redemption and forgiveness. And so here's a chance to offer Christian forgiveness or Christian redemption. It's really interesting how they've taken their traditional language and turned it on crime. But the net effect of this is that you have got people on both left and right coming together with a common cause from very different direction. And they're breaking through that tribalism we talked about at the start.
Yeah.
And they're finding common ground to achieve a common good for their society. And the prison population has fallen. Now, of course, I'm not saying that American justice system is perfect because we all know we know it's not. But it is a positive sign there. And it's one we don't have in this country. So it does show there that, put aside your differences and you can find common ground. And I found that a really interesting lesson to see. And again, we've seen it in Europe. We saw it in Norway. We've seen it in other countries as well.
Well, it's back to this point where, like I say for the article, is where did I put it? There's no agreement on the cause of crime or even the purpose of punishment. I keep coming back to that purpose of punishment. So, for example, life sentence is 25 years. Why 25? Why 20? Why not 15? What do you learn in the last 10 years that you didn't learn in the first 15 years? What is the cost of those 10? These are things I don't know the answer to. Are there historical reasons? I don't know.
To be honest, I don't know. Of course, a lot of people don't serve that. And we also now have the tragedy of indeterminate prison sentences as well, which were introduced by Labour. Let's not forget, people see this as a right-wing issue. Under Labour, under Tony Blair, under New Labour, they introduced effectively one new punishment every day they were in power. It was scandalous what they did. And prison sentencing has drastically increased under the Tories. So the length of sentence, there's been sentence inflation, so people are serving longer for the same offences.
Why has that happened?
To keep the public happy, to keep the tabloids happy, to play to the gallery.
Do you think anyone is feeling that and seeing that and aware that there's people spending more time in prison thinking they're doing their job? It doesn't feel like it's something that's working.
No, but can you tell me the politician who stood up and said we should have shorter sentences? Can you tell me the politician who said we shouldn't jail this person for a long time? It takes political bravery to do that, and we don't see that. The tragedy of Michael Gove, actually, who I took out to see this in Texas, is he bought into a lot of these ideas. And actually, I think he was a contrarian, bold enough politician that whether you like him or hate him, he might have actually done some of this. And of course, coming from where he came politically, it would have been more acceptable, say, than if a Labour person had done it.
Well, I always find ex-politicians are the most interesting politicians because they can be honest at that point. Yeah. And I think that's one of the problems with.
Well, there's another veteran politician called Bob Ainsworth, a Labour guy, who was I think Minister of State in the Home Office, and he's a very old school Labour guy. And a lot of the old school Labour guys are quite small c, socially conservative, and he was brilliant because he came out as a drug reformer, seeing rightly that the war on drugs had failed and that we should legalise all drugs and focus on addiction rather than just locking people up. And Bob Ainsworth came out as the most unlikely drug reformer after he'd been in the Home Office because he saw that it wasn't working.
I've been talking to one of my friends who works at the Met about the work they're doing, trying to combat drug crime and trying to deal with county lines, etc. And it's funny, he's come to the conclusion that we can't stop this by it being a crime. He said, if you stop it being a crime, if you legalize the drugs, we don't any longer have to deal with this as a crime. He said the amount of resources that are going towards fighting an endless war and the amount of murders that are happening within gangs he said it's out of control. We can't stop it.
Well, he's right. All we've done is we've handed the market to the most violent people in the world.
Yes.
And the people who win that market are those prepared to go to the greatest lengths of violence to control it. And a lot of police now, in fact, in Britain, actually, it's been de facto legalized drugs in several counties because the police chiefs recognise there's no point locking people up. It makes no difference. It was all begun in Durham under a chief constable who was running the best, the most widely praised, very traditional chief constable. And he suddenly saw that the war on drugs wasn't working. And so he stopped locking people up and started offering them diversion into treatment instead. And he ended up saying, I'm not even going to lock up people who are dealing heroin if they're just dealing to sustain their own habit. It's a waste of time. It doesn't make any difference. You know, you look at the fact that the prices of drugs in this country have declined and the purity has increased. What does that tell you about the market? Has it ended or is it thriving? We have a whole raft of new synthetic drugs, so you can't stop it. There's new drugs coming in the whole time. The war on drugs is one of the biggest failures. Most politicians know it, and they're too scared again to say anything about it.
Why not deal with it? I mean, you know, Gavin, who I had here, Ken Southey Nathan, to discuss just cannabis alone. And even today, I was reading an article. There's an ex-Arsenal player who's playing football up in Scotland. Manuel,
Greenock Morton, I read that.
And he got
£600,000 worth of drugs he was dealing.
But it was cannabis.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, I'd be like, what a dangerous criminal. I looked and thought, he's selling a plant. Why? What?
Which does less damage than alcohol.
It's considerably less damage to society than alcohol. I don't know anybody who's violent when they smoke a joint.
But I actually find obviously cannabis should be legal.
Yeah.
But I find that almost a boring argument. The more, because it's so obvious.
Yeah.
You know, we all know, everyone knows it's less damaging than alcohol.
Yes.
So is ecstasy.
Yes.
The issue is the harder issue are drugs which are harmful. You know, cocaine can be a very corrosive drug.
Yes.
Heroin can be, particularly if it's adulterated, a very dangerous drug. It feeds, and you know, addiction is a horrible thing for people. The more interesting argument is this the best way to handle them? I'm utterly convinced that it's much better if we take it out of police hands. Portugal is the prime example of this, of course, where Portugal had a huge heroin problem, effectively decriminalized it, and went for a sort of diversion treatment approach, and has seen absolute plummeting in terms of certainly fatalities. Britain, of course, is responsible for 1/3 of European drug fatalities. You know, we're still stuck on this ridiculous system, which everyone knows is wrong. Most politicians know is wrong. Certainly most police know is wrong. Even Theresa May's local police chief, with her consent, shifted from a bust type approach to a rehabilitative approach.
But what I don't understand why it's not become a policy. Yeah,
it's fear, isn't it? It's fear, I think, of being monstered by the media.
Do you think they've tested it and it just doesn't work? It's just because like someone like a Reform Party.
Nigel Farage did support it.
But I'm saying it's go broad and loud with full drug reform.
The problem for politicians also is you have to understand that I would advocate a mental health system, to go back to that, whereby you don't lock people up. Mm-hmm. But the likelihood is if that happens, there will be cases where someone who isn't locked up kills someone.
Well, that goes back to the Silk. So the Silk Road, I don't know if you know the Silk Road, but that's how I got into Bitcoin. I was buying drugs on the internet with Bitcoin. And when Ross Ulbricht was captured and put on trial, during the course of the trial, they brought in six parents whose children had bought drugs on the Silk Road and had died. It was completely emotional, completely manipulative, and he got a double life sentence, 40 years, the kingpin charge. But there is a reality that the Drug Policy Alliance said buying drugs on the Silk Road was safer than buying on the street because there was less impurities, because the Silk Road had dealer ratings. So people would buy the drugs, say, oh, this dealer's doing the best, the purest So it was it got us as close to a professional marketplace as possible, to a legitimate marketplace, and it reduced violence on the streets. It reduced violence between gangs, violence at the point of purchase, because people aren't going on hiding behind a Tesco's and maybe getting robbed. There was no violence between gangs because I know one guy, we've run an article where they built their own little like Amazon distribution warehouses. And so all these upsides were proven, but they brought in these emotional stories.
And the problem is some people, however good the system, just like some people die from alcohol, some people die mountaineering, some people will die because there is a risk element.
Some people will die.
And that is, I think you have to understand from the politician, that's a big call to take that, because you're going to get monstered in the world we live in if something happens which can be blamed on you. It's the same in in the childcare system. You look at what happened with Baby P, whereby mistakes were made, and the staff responsible for really bad mistakes got monstered. So now every social worker is aware of that, so they're more likely to be cautious. And we have a society which has a bias towards caution, and that's not necessarily a good thing.
Well, then how do we get a shift? Because these things aren't working. I mean, look at the drugs again. This Twitter account I told you about, every day, stabbing, another stabbing, 2 people stabbed. They're all young. It's
there is a shift going, even in this country, where the debate is rather traditional, shall we say. Chief constables have got fed up with waiting for Parliament to act, and a lot of them are beginning to shift and effectively decriminalising drugs within their own patch. They're sort of doing it on the QT, but with a nod and a wink. But the trouble is, it's still.
I wonder what that nod and the wink is, though. It's like, okay, this is what I expect of you. Was it Bloomberg? Was it, or Giuliani in New York? Didn't he clean up New York by
the broken windows theory?
Yeah.
It is a problem. It's a big problem. I mean, it's easy to be rational. It's easy for me as a journalist, but then I'm not the one making that decision. I think sometimes we forget, for politicians, it's a really hard job, and they're assailed from all sides. It's very easy to throw stones at them and say they're all crap and say they're all stupid and say why they're not doing the right thing. Equally, it's not a job I would want to do.
No,
and although it's really important, in the world we live in, you're getting a lot of shit thrown at you left, right, and center the whole time, and you can't really do right. So equally, while I can be very critical of politicians, I also have sympathy for the fact that they are human beings trying to do a really difficult job, which in the world we live in today is even harder. And there's a lot of violence. A lot of them face a lot of violent threats. And I'm sometimes shocked when I see some of the stuff that's being said to people, and people treat them like shit. So while I'm
journalist as well, though,
it's not as bad. It's not as bad.
Depends where you live in the world, but it can be.
Oh no, of course. Yeah. I'm talking about British journalists.
But I'm sure you've had attacks and people criticize you.
Yeah, but
it's not an easy job. Every time you're doing an opinion piece, you're going to piss off one group of people.
Yeah, but I just tend to block anyone who swears at me or is rude to me, and you do. Yeah, no, there is truth to that.
I think you're being kind. Well, let me put it a different way.
I try to be kind though, if I can.
Because you're a nice bloke. But I think we're really struggling for good leadership. Honesty and integrity. I think we've still been talked to like we're fucking idiots.
I agree, but there's also systemic problems. You look at politics. Money corrupts politics.
Of course.
It corrupts it in Britain. It corrupts it in America, even worse. That would be one. If it was me, that would be one thing I'd do, which is
pay them more.
Well, possibly, but certainly what I would do is something I absolutely hate the idea of, and that would be state funding. Which I think is horrible
idea.
State
funding for
of political parties.
Okay.
I think it's a horrible idea, and it goes against everything I sort of believe in. But at the same time, I can't see alternative systems, because if you rely on rich people, the system gets corrupted.
Of course.
You could, of course, just say you can only have no one can pay more than £10, say, to a political party, but then it's going to be quite hard for them to operate. But money is a corrosive force, and nowhere is that truer than politics.
Well, I mean, I just think we should pay them a lot more.
But then I'd love to see the politician who stands up and says, right, we should pay politicians and £100,000 a year basic and pay the Prime Minister $300,000.
I'd pay them even more than that. I know it's
That's why you're not a politician. That's why you're sitting there as...
I'm not, but there's an inertia to it, to these ideas. I remember when they
But
came
how
out,
can a politician say that?
But they need to
They'd
come
get
out
monstered.
I think there's ways of doing it.
There's no way for a politician to say, pay us a lot more money.
I think there's one way of doing it. I think an outgoing politician says, this is what I think we should do, and I'm going to quit so I don't benefit from it. But if you're super smart, if you're clever, and you're leaving school, if you're a person who've got good arguments, good integrity, you could go and become a career politician and maybe get to 90 grand a year. But most people are thinking in their heads, I want to earn six figures. And it's not even 100 grand these days. It's 200 grand, 250 grand a year. I think if you paid politicians £500,000 a year, you would start to get the best people wanting those jobs.
I still think the sorts of people who could earn those sorts of sums might think life is nicer without all the shit that goes with being a politician.
Sure, but I still think
I think
the
it's
market
much more
will give you better
important.
people.
I mean, what I would like to find are ways to harness the good in this society, the good in communities, the good in people, and find ways to harness that to come up with a better approach and better solutions. I don't think money is going to do it. I think if you get people who are doing it for money, they're going to be doing it for ambition, they're going to be doing it for venal reasons, and they're going to be not necessarily coming up with the best solutions. What I'd like to see is people who actually find ways to harness the best brains in society. And the best people in society come up with solutions. I go back to the Texas example on crime. Why can we not find ways whereby on social care, which is the biggest public policy failing of this country over the last 30, 40 years, why can we not find a system where we just park all the differences, work out what people want, which is to provide decent care, and then try and find a way to deliver it? Drugs, we could do the same thing. I'm pretty certain if you put everyone in the same room, you'd come up with a pretty clear solution, which is basically Portugal or some form thereof. 25 countries are shifting towards that. So Britain will eventually.
We'll be the last. What's quite interesting, there's a couple of points during this chat. You've brought up the fact that there's been progress when when the left and the right have come together on issues. I'm pretty sure if you had... or
if you have someone who just sort of thinks they really believe in it. I mean, Thatcher made progress because she believed in it.
Sure, but I think this is one of my bigger issues with politics. I remember I interviewed Ted Cruz, and I don't know if he'd never been asked this question before. But I was just a little bit trolly, but I thought it was a good question at the same time. At a time when political discourse is that everything the other party does is wrong and everything we does is right, I said, can you name me one thing that the progressives do that you agree with, that you think is good?
What did he say?
He ummed and ahed, and then he came out with it was a really ropey answer. I mean, it was a couple of years ago, but it was something along the lines of they're really good at arguing their points or something. And I was like, no. Yes, but I was going to give me one thing. He said, no, I can't. And listen, it's not hard as a conservative to come up with some progressive policy that's been pushed in the past that's been good for society. But I think there is this... And I don't know what the incentive structure is.
In this country, most people on the right would perhaps say gay rights, where they've changed their position laudably.
Or the cannabis laws in the US. Perhaps he could have said something like that. I don't know during which time these policies enacted, so I probably should get some key examples. But
Cruz is not a man renowned for his charm.
Do you know what? He's all right, actually. I tell you the one thing I did notice about him, he's very well researched on every topic he has to be. And so the topic, obviously, I was talking to him about was about Bitcoin. I was blown away by how much he'd researched and knew about it. That was impressive. Apart from that, I'm just not impressed with him at all because he is an ideologically driven politician. And the problem with ideology is everyone is the enemy. And so...
You should ask that of any politicians you get here. It's a great question.
Well, so...
You should make that your...
That's my thing.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Or anyone, if you vote, what do you think the other side do best? But and I think this is an issue. Say if the Labour government came out and said, we think we should decriminalise or even legalise marijuana, cannabis, for use both recreationally and medically, and we'll go, over a 2-year program to do it. instantly they're going to get right-wing press attack it and right-wing politicians attack Keir Starmer in Parliament. We know that's going to happen. But the logical thing that you know and I know is that Keir Starmer should get in a room with Rishi Sunak and say, this is best for the country for these reasons. Do you agree? And he said, yes, I do agree. Let's go and do it. Let's go and do it. But the structure of politics is such you must fight on every issue. And I don't know why we've got to this point. Why can't we have more bipartisan ideas?
I guess because it is a fight for survival, a fight for power. And if
lose then.
And we have seen cases in the past whereby they have come to agreements and then someone shafted the other person.
But if you think about it,
you're right. I absolutely agree with you.
But if Keir Starmer went to Richie and said, well, I agree. I'd be like, do you know what? That Richie's right.
Yeah, I think the thing is the public would really like that sort of approach. The public would love to see less tribalism. The public would love to see more collegiate approach, more consensual approach. I agree.
Very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
I don't know if you know, I did 7 weeks working with David Cameron.
Did you?
Yeah, I was his speechwriter during the 2010 election.
Okay.
For which I have written articles.
You had some fucking cool jobs.
For which I have written articles apologising for all the subsequent events such as Brexit. But on the night the coalition was formed, I said to him, we were talking, and I said, listen, you've got a unique opportunity here. Why don't you let people say what they want in politics? We all know that not every Conservative signs up to agrees the same thing. We know that not every cabinet minister agrees. Why don't you use this? You're forming a coalition. Use this to break down that tribalism. And he looked at me for a second, then he said, no, never work.
But you see it, people lose the whip, don't they, if they vote against certain policies. And I just think, what is this real democracy, or is this just...
Well, you need a degree of discipline. You can't have a free-for-all, really, I don't think. You do need some discipline. Otherwise, would you ever pass anything? I don't know, but maybe you'd only pass it if you argued it well enough.
I mean, I think of Bitcoin's rules of consensus. Bitcoin is very hard to change. It's very hard, very, very hard, and it's good for that. It means new rules in Bitcoin very rarely come in. Whereas we live in a country now where we have just... I don't... Someone told me the number once, the amount of new laws we get every year. It's ridiculous. I mean, as somebody who operates businesses, the number of rules and laws that I have to follow to open a cafe is ridiculous. And so, I don't know. I think we need something new in politics. It's not working. Voter turnout's low. Trust in government's low. I'm just waiting for that politician to stand up and be different. Just stand up and put their arm across the aisle and say, yeah, let's make some changes.
I agree. The trouble is the likely solution to that is the sort of populist figure you're seeing in some parts of Europe. And a lot of these people are people who are basically very ambitious and are using ordinary people for their own ends.
Yeah, I don't see as...
I see Farage, some people may love Farage. Personally, I see him as the worst example of this, someone who has done very well himself and used other people for his own ambition and used ordinary people and used the concerns of people in other parts of the country and economic struggles and issues and things like that purely for his own purposes.
Have you spent time with him?
I have met him, but I don't know him well.
So I did an interview with him.
And he can be charming, he can be funny, all that. I don't disagree with that, but I'm more interested in someone who's actually cares about the country and cares about ordinary people and wants to change things for the better.
Yeah, I spent some time with him before an interview, and I found him a very different person to sit and chat with than to do in an interview. I found him rational. I found some of his arguments are good. Even if I didn't agree with them, I had a really good chat. And so I consider that's Nigel. And then I did the interview, and then Farage comes out, and it's a character that plays a role. And
it's a very successful character.
Well,
and he's been a very,
Yeah.
effective politician. There's no doubt about that.
and he has tapped into concerns people have,
Yeah.
and some of them are right to be discussed.
Yeah.
I mean, there is.
There is disgust with politics. There has been inequality has grown. There's people left behind. There's a lot of very real concerns that he tapped into.
Yeah.
My beef would be, he's not really offering solutions. He's exploiting them. But then there aren't many people offering solutions.
It's funny. Some people come in this room and they will absolutely love Farage, and some people come in and they cannot stand him. He's a polarizing figure like that. But I do think that kind of politician that could come out, not a populist, I would say more a rationalist, somebody who can tap into everyone's concern. So, for example, I always come back to money. A politician who can rightly point that we have a tax and a borrowing system and a debt system which makes everyone poorer. So let's start with policies that makes everyone better off. Then you can tap into everyone. And then somebody who could reach across the aisle and say, look, we need there's some very logical things we could do. Maybe some Finnish-style critical thinking that we make our education.
But the thing is, they're all controversial. If you stand up and say, let's legalize all drugs, which I would say, look at the polling on it. It's miney.
But you can start lower. You can just start with marijuana. You can just start there. I mean,
Well,
cannabis shouldn't be controversial anymore.
Yeah, it still is actually, but yeah.
The tax. Well, I mean, if you frame it in a certain way, that the tax receipts maybe are used for, drug treatment for addicts.
Yeah, sure.
But I would legalize them all. I would change it. I don't know, Ian. I'm at this time where I'm really frustrated.
No, I totally share. I see a system which isn't working. I see a political system which isn't working, a care system that isn't working, a health system that isn't working, a financial system that isn't working, an economic system that isn't working. But equally, I am still an optimist who has great faith in humanity and ordinary people and a belief that we can make it better. I'm less optimistic about global affairs, where I see what's happening in the world as I travel around and report from hotspots. That's a bigger concern and a different concern.
Is it one of the worst times you've seen?
I suppose I'm a child of the Cold War, and then we all grew up in the Cold War, fearing the possibility of nuclear holocaust. So that was a pretty dark period, but certainly since 1989, it's the worst, and I think there's a very real threat of it. I mean, you go to Eastern Europe and all the countries on the front line, the Baltics, Poland, etc., anticipate there's a very high chance that they're going to be at war.
Yeah, I heard in Lithuania they're widening the roads just in case, that like in preparation.
Yeah. Poland is boosting its spending to 4% and is drastically driving up its armed force size of its army. It'll have the most powerful army in Europe. The British army is preparing, it's looking at how do we get our troops to Estonia? How do we get them through to Poland? How do we get American forces through? There is an expectation that there's a very strong chance that warfare is going to happen. And that's without even talking about China and what's going to happen with Taiwan, let alone the conflagration in the Middle East. It's a difficult period. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I mean, I have no answers. I'm just very depressed about the idea that I thought the idea of large global conflicts were a thing of history that we learned in the history books.
That's why Ukraine, I think, was such a shock to Europe, because it's like an old-fashioned war with tanks and trenches and things like that, and horrible bloodshed and bombs, and now with drones and all the rest of it. That's why it was so frightening, I think, for people, and such a reminder of the past.
Well, I mean, some of the new tactics of warfare have kind of brought a reality that it's a different way wars are being fought. I mean, the whole Hezbollah thing, just maybe I shouldn't have my phone so close to me anymore. It's all this.
You're not a Hezbollah member, though, I see.
No, do you know what? I was out in Lebanon a year ago today. Actually, I was making a documentary there about corruption. Can you remember?
Good. It's a good place to make a documentary on corruption.
Fucking hell. Well, it's a great country. I mean, the people are incredible, truly incredible. It's one of my favorite places I've ever been. Can you remember that city we went to?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so right near the Israeli border, a large Hezbollah stronghold. And I said, I was just being typical naive, but I was like, can I go? Can we meet anyone from Hezbollah? Can we get an interview? And they're like, no, you don't do that. But I was really intrigued by it. I've always been really intrigued by Hezbollah as a pick my words carefully, because if I said an army, people are like, no, they're terrorists. And if I said terrorists, people
Militia.
are like, no, they're an
Militia,
army.
you
No,
say.
militia. But I've always been really intrigued.
I met the head of Islamic Jihad in Gaza.
Did you?
Yeah.
You
But the trouble is with all these places, like you mentioned that, and you said what a great place it is.
It's amazing.
You go to Tel Aviv, it's a fantastic city. It's one of the best cities in the world. You go to Gaza, and the young people there are phenomenal. I love being in Gaza, and it was really interesting to see young people who were finding ways to fight against Hamas. You know, they hated Hamas because Hamas are ultra-conservative, corrupt, and they knew they was, you know, obviously, they had issues about Israel and the wall and not being allowed to get out of that little enclave. But equally, they could see that Hamas was corrosive to their lives and their country. And they were finding ways to protest. I met one amazing guy who had led protests. He'd got used Facebook to harness dissent among young people. And he thought, okay, I can't attack Hamas because that way I'll get beaten up, killed, tortured, whatever. Mm-hmm. So they protested against the power cuts, and he built a big movement protesting against power cuts, which was really a protest against government, but it wasn't quite. You know, it's really tragic what's happening there because on both sides there's awful leadership. You know, the Israeli leadership is catastrophically bad. Yep. The Palestinian leadership is catastrophically bad, whether it's in the West Bank with Abbas or with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And yet, as ever in so many parts of the world, the people are, by and large, fantastic, and everyone wants the same thing, which is a nice life, enough money to, you know, do what they want to do, look after their families, etc., etc. And, you know, catastrophe is coming in the Middle East, is engaged in Gaza. It's bad in the northern parts of Israel. And I fear worse is about to come with what we're going to see with Hezbollah and Israel.
Yeah, reaction from Hezbollah we've seen that. There was more. I think I read this morning that there were new missile attacks in Lebanon from Israel.
Well, you assume this is all about weakening Hezbollah ahead of an attack to try and push Hezbollah back so that those communities on the very northern border. Funny enough, the first time I went to Israel was 1982 when I worked in a kibbutz on the Golan Heights. And it was just as the...
why did everyone from your generation, you're only a bit older than me, work in a kibbutz?
Because it was a free holiday.
Oh, was that what it was?
Yeah, and it was fun. And it was just after the invasion of Lebanon, 2 days beforehand. And so everyone said, don't go. Actually, it was quite a good time to go. But it was interesting because that was Ariel Sharon sending the tanks in. It was meant to just last for 3 days, and it lasted for much longer, and it was a catastrophe. And in a way, I have to choose my words carefully here, but that was the moment when Israel began to lose the sheen of always fighting defensive wars and fighting a much more offensive stuff, leaving aside the history and the land ownership issues and such like that. You could argue that was the moment that Israel's image began to really change. And of course, Sharon was such an interesting character because he was hated. But then at the very end of his life, he became a peacenik, and threw the settlers, I think threw a few thousand settlers out of the Gaza and gave the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians, leading to the election which led to Hamas. So, you know, he was the classic, like Menachem Begin, the prime minister, the classic sort of hard guy who became a peacenik at the end of his life.
Do you think that happened with Netanyahu?
No, I think Netanyahu is a very different kettle of fish who is just a totally self-serving,
power-hungry
individual who is, I think, destroying Israel in order to protect himself from corruption charges. And I think it's an utter tragedy. I mean, it looks like there is evidence to suggest that he deliberately supported Hamas in Gaza in order to divide and rule the Palestinians, to stop them uniting. And I just think he's an absolutely catastrophic leader for the country. And while obviously the attacks by Hamas were horrendous, what went on with the rape and the killing and everything, and utter atrocities that are unforgivable, at the same time, the Israeli response, people said, don't do what they did with 9/11, you know, look, act wisely. Of course, you have a right to attack the Hamas leadership and to attack Hamas, but don't do something which makes the situation worse. But in order to save his own skin and protect himself from being prosecuted and being thrown out of office, I think he's destroying Israel's reputation, which personally and is destroying Israel in many ways, which personally I find very sad. And equally, the hopes of a feasible two-state solution, it's just, I can't see where you go from here. I can't see how you rebuild any hopes of peace. I can't see how the Palestinians will not respond in such an aggressive way when Gaza has been flattened and destroyed, when you see what's going on with the settlers on the West Bank. I think it's such a tragedy.
It's a cycle I've witnessed my whole life. I tried as a youngster.
But it's so much worse. It's so much worse. I mean, don't forget, they came very close to peace.
Yeah.
If Yasser Arafat hadn't scotched it, they were very close to peace. And, we could have had peace 24 years ago.
How did it break down?
It broke down because there was a very carefully negotiated peace deal. And in the end, Yasser Arafat refused to accept the terms of the deal in relation, I think, to Jerusalem itself, to East Jerusalem. And but they were so close to it. And, then there was real hope of peace with a generation of leaders who might have delivered it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, then there were killings, assassinations, and we've ended up where we are today with Netanyahu and Hamas and the horrors taking place on both sides.
Yeah, it's like I say, it's a cycle I've felt my whole life. It's depressing to see.
But again, we go back to tribalism because it seems, I don't understand why it seems so hard for people to say, well, the Palestinian leadership's been awful. What Hamas did was hideous and unacceptable and disgusting. And equally, the Israeli reaction has been horrendously over the top and self-destructive, and they're terribly led. I can't.
This is common sense, Ian.
Of course, it's common sense.
But it pisses me off. I mean, when it first happened, I very clearly on this show and put my opinions out there as I'm a very simple man, but I have huge sympathy for the people of Israel who've been attacked by terrorists and murdered and terrorized, and I have a huge sympathy now for what the people of Gaza are going to face, which is obliteration. I personally think it's pretty much genocidal what's happening. I don't need it to be labeled genocidal to know it's horrific. I've seen the reporting. I've seen the reports on how many have been killed, injured, the mental health issues. Fuck knows what it's like living there. It's horrific. It's horrific. But again, it comes back to the same thing. It's like I'm a simple person. I don't understand why a hand of friendship is never tried. Why not try the hand of friendship?
But the tragedy, of course, of what happened was that those kibbutz people who were attacked by Hamas, many of them were the people who were holding out that hand of friendship. That's what's so tragic.
Yeah, but it needs a political hand.
I talked about that dissident I met within Hamas. He was really interesting because when I talked to him about Israel, he believed in the right to return. He believed in the fact that, Palestinians should get their land back that was stolen. But equally, he believed in Israel's continued existence. And when I questioned why, it's because those kibbutz people who were attacked by Hamas, they'd taken him to hospital and he'd had very severe stomach surgery in Israel, in Tel Aviv, helped by those very people. So he understood that Israelis were not monsters, that a lot of them were good people and good human beings who shared the same interests and view and beliefs in life as he did.
It's just come back to that same point. Shit leadership.
Yeah.
Bad people. A lack of given a hand of friendship. The inertia for doing what is the right thing. I mean, look, they're going to have to meet their own God and face this.
And equally, it's harder. I do think it's harder in a world that we live in which drives tribalism. And, we go back to where we began with social media and things like that. I think politics is a lot harder today and societies are more divided, and it's depressing to see.
But I think there is a demand for something else. I think there's a demand. People want something different because it's...
A lot of people are very angry, though.
Yeah, of course.
People feel failed, they feel let down, and there is anger out there, and anger is toxic.
I mean, I don't know the answer. I don't want to finish on such a depressing note. What else are you working on?
What else am I working on?
Anything positive?
I've just written a book review for The Spectator. In fact, I can give
There we go. That's a nice place to finish.
I'll even give you the book in my bag.
Did Unheard just buy Spectator?
Well, Paul Marshall, the proprietor of Unheard, has just bought The Spectator.
Do you know why I quite like Spectator? I'll give you one
and
reason.
Tortoise is buying The Observer.
Okay.
New media is buying up chunks of traditional old media. It's very interesting.
Poacher turned gatekeeper. The Spectator wrote a Bitcoin article once, and it was completely wrong, and it was factually wrong and not very good. And I wrote to the guy written it. I said, "You've got a lot of this wrong." And he said, "Do you want to write a new article that corrects it?" And I said, "Yes." So I wrote a new article for them, which my brother helped me construct. They made a couple of changes, but more kind of stylistic changes, and they published it. I was like, "I like you guys." Same thing happened with the FT. They rewrote my article so many times, they whitewashed it down to like nothing. Didn't happen, but I was quite a fan of the Spectator. So show me. Have you got it?
I don't know where my bag is. There's someone's.
You show me after.
Been stolen. Anyway, it's Timothy Snyder's book on freedom.
Okay. Wow.
Which is a treatise on the nature of freedom by someone who's very expert in Ukraine and Eastern Europe and such like, but also very skeptical and alarmed by the fact that America is sliding towards fascism.
Right. Okay. Gosh.
Nice cheerful book for you.
Big topics. Okay. Well, I'm definitely going to read this Mum, Dad, Hitler and Stalin. I'm currently reading Why, which is a philosophical book about the creation of the universe, which I find quite interesting. Once I'm done with that, I think I'll move on to...
Danny Finkelstein's book on Mum, Dad, Hitler and Stalin is absolutely extraordinary. It's like a sort of thriller at times, and it ties together the crimes of both, obviously, Hitler and Stalin for a Jewish family. And it's truly... I mean, I've known him for, 20 years, and it's just... absolutely astonishing family story, which I had no idea of the depth of it and everything.
Right.
Really, and it's a beautiful book, written really well.
That's my next read. Ian, thank you. Appreciate you coming and doing this. I hope next time I see you, like the world will be a better place and we haven't slid into even more fucking chaos.
That'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Be lovely. Good to see you, man.
Thank you, and good luck with everything and with the new podcast.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.